There comes a time in every soul's journey when the pain of illusion becomes more unbearable than the pain of truth. When the mirror cracks, and what once reflected love now reveals a mask, cold, hollow and deceiving, this is the moment the empath awakens, not gently but with fire. What begins as love becomes entanglement. What feels like connection is in fact a lunar dance between the wounded and the manipulative. The empath, drawn by the ancient instinct to heal, steps willingly into the lair of the narcissist, believing they are rescuing another, unaware that they are confronting the shadow of their own unconscious. In the beginning, the empath enters the relationship believing they have found something profound, something rare. There is an intensity that feels faded, almost spiritual, a recognition as if two souls have met across time. This illusion is powerful because it mimics true connection, but it is not rooted in mutuality. It is a performance, a projection, a carefully orchestrated mirror that reflects back the empath's own longings, ideals and buried wounds. The narcissist is drawn not to the empath's love, but to their light, to the depth of feeling, to the vulnerability, to the capacity for endless giving. And the empath, unaware of the trap, sees the narcissist's brokenness and believes it is love that can heal it. What the empath does not yet understand is that they are not meeting the person as they are, but as the narcissist wishes to be seen. It is a mask, charming, magnetic, intoxicating, and it is designed to disarm. The empath, attuned to pain and adept at nurturing, mistakes this for intimacy. They lean in, they listen, they offer themselves fully, and in doing so, they begin to abandon their own needs, boundaries, and intuition. The narcissist thrives in this space, where the empath becomes so intent the other that they forget their own. Slowly, the dynamic shifts. Subtly, insidiously, what once felt like love becomes confusion. The narcissist withdraws affection, then offers it again, keeping the empath locked in a cycle of emotional starvation and intermittent reward. The empath, believing love must be earned, works harder. They give more, they try to fix, to soothe, to explain, to understand. But the rules keep changing, the goalposts move. No matter how much the empath gives, it is never enough, and if they dare to voice their pain, they are met with dismissal, gaslighting, or rage. This is the beginning of the descent. The empath, once confident in their capacity to love, now questions their worth, their sanity, their very reality. They begin to internalize the dysfunction, to believe that they are too sensitive, too emotional, too much. They become isolated, not always physically, but emotionally and psychologically. The world that once felt safe is now full of tension, walking on eggshells, waiting for the next silent treatment or explosion. The empath, once vibrant, begins to shrink. And yet, something within resists. It may be faint at first, a whisper beneath the chaos, but it is the soul remembering itself. It is the quiet knowing that something is not right. That this is not what love is meant to feel like. But to acknowledge this truth is terrifying. Because it means confronting the illusion. It means facing the possibility that what felt like destiny was in fact a trap. That what seemed like love was really control. That the person they gave everything to was never truly present. This stage is not just heartbreak, it is existential. It is the shattering of identity. Because the empath built so much of their self around being the one who loves, who understands, who never gives up. And now they must question, who am I without this role? What do I do with all this pain, all this betrayal, all this grief? It is here, in the ashes of disillusionment, that the seed of awakening is planted. The empath does not yet know where this path will lead. They may still cling to hope, still seek closure, still long for the apology that will never come. But the spell has been broken. The light is beginning to pierce through the fog, even if only faintly. And though they may not yet see it, this is the beginning of their transformation. The self they once abandoned is waiting. The truth they once avoided is now demanding to be seen. And what lies ahead is not the restoration of the old self, but the emergence of something entirely new. The second stage begins when the illusion can no longer hold on the weight of accumulated pain. The empath, who once saw the narcissist through a lens of potential and woundedness, begins to see fragments of a harsher reality. Moments that once seemed like misunderstandings begin to reveal themselves as patterns. Words once taken as accidental cruelty now echo with intention. The empath begins to feel something they have suppressed for a long time. Rage, confusion, betrayal. But they do not yet know what to do with it. It is as though they are waking up in a story they no longer recognize, surrounded by contradictions that pull at the edges of their trust. Their inner compass, once so reliable, has been thrown off by repeated invalidation and emotional manipulation. And now it spins with no clear direction. What begins to stir within the empath is not merely a reaction to the narcissist's behavior, but a deeper confrontation with their own unconscious. They begin to sense that they are not just victims of someone else's darkness but participants in a dynamic that draws from their own unexamined wounds. This realization does not come all at once. It emerges slowly, painfully in the silence after yet another dismissal, in the emptiness left behind by another broken promise. The empath begins to hear a new voice within them, a voice that does not beg, does not plead, does not try to explain, but questions. Why do I stay? Why do I feel responsible for someone else's healing? Why does love have to hurt like this? This is the moment of rupture. The first real fracture between who they were in the relationship and who they are becoming. The empath begins to realize that their compulsion to give, to fix, to absorb blame was not born in this relationship alone. It was planted long before, often in childhood, in early environments where love was conditional. Where being good meant being quiet, compliant, endlessly available. The narcissist simply fit into a pattern that was already familiar, already encoded deep in the psyche. The awakening, then, is not just about seeing the narcissist for who they are, but seeing the self unmasked, vulnerable, unfinished. It is an encounter with the shadow, not as a distant concept, but as a living presence within. The empath may resist this awareness. They may try to return to denial, to hope, to the fantasy that this is all a phase, that love will win, that the narcissist will change. But the shadow, once seen, cannot be unseen. It begins to speak through dreams, through body aches, through the silence that now feels more honest than the narcissist's words. The empath feels torn between loyalty to the past and responsibility to the self. They are caught in the painful in-between, where the truth is known but not yet fully integrated. This is the psychological liminal space where the old self dies but the new self has not yet been born. In this stage, the empath often feels deep grief, not only for the relationship, but for the parts of themselves they had to suppress in order to survive it. The grief is multi-layered. It is mourning the years spent trying to be enough. It is mourning the year since that once believed love was always a force for good. It is mourning the inner child who only ever wanted to be safe, seen, and loved without having to bleed for it. And though the empath may still be surrounded by the narcissist's presence or haunted by their absence, the real battle now is within. The war is no longer over the narcissist's approval but over reclaiming the truth of the self, which has been buried under years of self-sacrifice and spiritual forgetting. The empath does not yet feel powerful in this stage. They may feel raw, fragmented, unsure of what is real. But there is a quiet strength beginning to grow. Not the strength of endurance, which they have long mastered, but the strength of awareness. They begin to see through the manipulation. They begin to name the gaslighting. They begin to trust the feeling in their gut that says, this is not love. The false self they built to survive, the one who always forgives, always understands, always gives, begins to crack, and through those cracks, something ancient and true begins to rise from within. As the empath begins to awaken to the truth of what they have endured, a quiet but resolute shift starts to occur. A separation not only from the narcissist, but from the internal patterns that made such an entanglement possible. This is not merely the decision to leave a person, it is the unraveling an entire identity. For so long the empath has played the role of healer, peacekeeper, emotional anchor. The one who forgives, the one who bends in all directions to avoid conflict or preserve connection. But now, with the illusion shattered and the shadow unveiled, there comes a moment when the empath begins to recognize that love without boundaries is not love at all, but self-abandonment disguised as compassion. In the quiet moments after chaos, when the noise of the narcissist's voice begins to fade, the empath hears something they have long ignored. The sound of their own soul calling them home. This stage is painful not because of the narcissist's departure, but because of the empath's return to themselves. They begin to feel the full weight of everything they silenced for the sake of the relationship. The ignored instincts. The swallowed words, the unmet needs. It is as though they are finally stepping out of a fog and seeing for the first time, the emotional cost of their loyalty. Every boundary they failed to set, every time they said yes when they wanted to say no. Every moment they absorbed someone else's rage or sadness believing it was their duty to carry it. These memories return, not to punish, but to be acknowledged and released. The empath begins to understand that healing is not about forgetting what happened, but about refusing to betray themselves again in the same way. As the separation deepens, the empath starts to establish boundaries. Not as walls to shut others out, but as sacred lines that protect their energy, time, and emotional well-being. These boundaries are not loud or aggressive, they are rooted in self-respect. They no longer justify their limits, no longer explain their choices to those who feel entitled to their energy. The empath begins to say no without guilt, to walk away without apology, to value their inner peace over external approval. For the first time, their worth is not being measured by what they can endure for others, but by how deeply they can honor themselves. This is unfamiliar terrain. It feels both liberating and terrifying, because they are no longer performing the role of savior. They are no longer proving their love through sacrifice. They are no longer staying in places that diminish their light. The narcissist, sensing the shift, may return with their old tactics: love bombing, guilt promises, apologies, but the empath no longer responds from the same place. They see the cycle for what it is, not because someone told them, but because they have lived it so many times that their body and soul now reject it instinctively. The hooks that once pulled at their compassion now fall flat. Because the empath has reclaimed something more powerful than approval: clarity. They no longer need closure from the narcissist, because they have found it within. They no longer seek to be understood by someone who was never truly listening. They no longer chase the mirage of who the narcissist could be, because they are now committed to who they themselves are becoming. In this stage, there is still grief, but it no longer drowns them, it becomes a teacher. There is still vulnerability, but it is no longer a weakness to be exploited. It becomes a source of strength. The empath realizes that their capacity to feel deeply is not a curse but a gift, one that must be protected, not given away indiscriminately. They begin to cultivate discernment, to recognize that not everyone who appears wounded wants to heal, that not every connection is sacred, and that love must flow in both directions to be real. This is not the empath becoming hardened or bitter, it is the empath becoming whole, grounded, and aware. They are no longer driven by the need to be chosen, because they have chosen themselves in the quiet aftermath of separation. When the chaos has subsided and the noise of the narcissist's presence no longer echoes in the empath's daily life, something profound begins to unfold. It is not a sudden transformation, but rather an inward turning, a sacred process of alchemy where pain is not avoided but faced, not numbed but transmuted. The empath, now walking alone, begins to sit with the rawness of their experience. The grief, the rage, the confusion, the longing, and for the first time, they do not run from it. They no longer distract themselves with fixing others, or explaining their wounds to people who never truly listened. Instead, they begin to listen inwardly. They begin to descend deeper into their own psyche, where the hidden parts of themselves, neglected, silenced, distorted, are waiting to be seen with compassion and truth. This stage is not without suffering. It is marked by long nights of reflection, by memories that surface uninvited, by emotions that seem too large to hold. But something within the empath has shifted. They no longer fear the pain the way they once did, because now they understand that the pain is not their enemy. It is their guide. It points to what still needs healing, to what was denied in the name of love, to what must be reclaimed. The empath begins to gather the fragmented parts of themselves, the inner child who felt unseen, the teenager who learned to shrink, the adult who tolerated emotional starvation as if it were normal, and they begin to hold these parts with tenderness. There is no blame here, only understanding. They begin to see that their pattern of overgiving, their tolerance of mistreatment, their deep need to be enough, were all rooted in a survival strategy forged in the fires of early emotional wounds. What was once shame now becomes insight. What was once confusion now becomes clarity. The empath begins to recognize that their sensitivity is not weakness, that their longing for connection is not naivety, and that their desire to help others was never wrong. But it must be anchored in self-awareness. They realize that love without boundaries leads to martyrdom, and that healing others while neglecting oneself is a slow form of self-destruction. In this awakening, they begin to rewrite the narrative. They no longer see themselves as broken or foolish for having loved someone incapable of loving them back. They see instead the depth of their heart, the courage of their spirit, the resilience of their soul. And with this understanding they begin to transform not just their thoughts, but their very energy. This is the work of emotional alchemy, turning pain into power, sorrow into wisdom, heartbreak into a doorway. The empath becomes more than a survivor. They become a creator. They begin to rebuild their inner world, this time not around the needs of others, but around the truth of who they are. They may return to forgotten passions, rediscover buried dreams, explore spiritual practices, or seek therapy not because they are broken, but because they are committed to becoming whole. They no longer seek external validation to define their worth. Instead, they draw their sense of value from an inner well that was always there, but had been obscured by years of emotional entanglement. They begin to trust themselves again. Not just their kindness but their discernment, their instincts, their ability to walk away from what does not serve their highest self. In this stage, the empath becomes intentional about the spaces they enter, the people they engage with, the energy they give. They are no longer impulsively drawn to who need fixing, nor seduced by chaos masquerading as passion. They recognize the difference between empathy and enmeshment, between love and codependency. They begin to live in alignment with their inner truth, choosing peace over drama, truth over illusion, self-respect over approval. Their emotional death becomes a sanctuary, not a battlefield. They begin to radiate a quiet power, not loud, not performative, but grounded, present, and rooted in a self that has finally been reclaimed. As the empath continues through the long, silent corridors of healing, something extraordinary begins to unfold. Not an event, not a moment of applause or external recognition, but a quiet, undeniable return to the self. This is not the self that once begged for crumbs of affection. Not the self that questioned its worth in the eyes of someone incapable of seeing it. And not the self that shaped itself around the needs of others in a desperate effort to be loved. This is a deeper self, an ancient self, the one that existed long before the pain, before the patterns, before the identity built on sacrifice and survival. It is not a version created for approval but one remembered in solitude. The empath begins to feel this return not through grand declarations, but through subtle shifts, choosing silence over explanation, walking away without needing to be right, saying yes only when it aligns with the truth of their being. This final stage is not about triumph over the narcissist, because by now, the narcissist has become irrelevant to the narrative. The obsession with closure fades, the need for revenge dissolves. The longing for validation disappears like mist in morning light. What remains is the self whole and sovereign, no longer defined by what it endured but by what it chose to become. The empath does not wear their trauma as a badge. Nor do they shrink in shame from the years lost in confusion. They have metabolized their suffering and turned it into vision. The very wounds that once left them bleeding now serve as portals to deeper wisdom, and every scar has become a symbol of sacred survival. They have faced their shadow and lived to tell the story, not as victims but as witnesses of their own rebirth. At this point in their evolution, the empath no longer views sensitivity as a weakness or compassion as a curse. They understand the difference between connection and captivity, between resonance and responsibility. They no longer confuse emotional labor with love or self-sacrifice with devotion. There is a precision in how they move now, an intentionality in what they allow, a deep trust in their own discernment. They do not chase, they attract. They do not explain, they embody. They no longer hope to be chosen by others because they have chosen themselves fully, deeply, and without hesitation. Relationships are no longer a place to lose themselves but a space to express themselves. They surround themselves not with people who need saving, but with those who honor their wholeness. There is an unmistakable stillness in this stage, a peace that does not need to be proven. It is not the absence of emotion, but the presence of emotional sovereignty. The empath has felt everything, lost everything, questioned everything, and emerged with a kind of clarity that cannot be shaken. They can now spot manipulation before it begins, recognize red flags before they bleed, and walk away without fear of being unloved. Because love is no longer something they beg for, perform for, or bleed for. Love is something they carry. Something they are. And in this understanding, they finally begin to experience the kind of relationships that nourish rather than deplete, that honor rather than demand, that grow rather than consume. There is no fanfare in this stage, no dramatic ending or cinematic closure. Only integration, only embodiment. The empath becomes a quiet force. A person who has walked through fire and returned with water. A person who has made peace with their past and no longer allows it to shape their future. They are no longer triggered by reminders of who they were, because they are no longer trying to escape themselves. They have become the home they were always searching for in others. And from this home, they now create, speak love, and live with a freedom that cannot be taken, manipulated, or dimmed by anyone. Again, to those who walked through this fire, know this: you were never broken. You were buried beneath the weight of another's emptiness. But you have risen. You have turned sovereign into sovereignty. You have made the unconscious conscious. And in doing so you have not only healed yourself, you have become a lighthouse for others who are still lost in the storm. This is the final stage, not an ending, but a beginning. The empath, once shattered, now stands whole, no longer a mirror for others, but a mirror of the divine within.